Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture in this benighted age, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes or by plugging our RSS feed into your favorite podcatcher. You can find the RSS feed on our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. We're also on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on Spotify, YouTube, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And visit patreon.com/VMSPod or paypal.me/VMSPod to make a one-time or recurring donation and help me continue to produce smart conversation about books, art, comics, and culture every week at the Virtual Memories Show. We are back after an unplanned week off. As I mentioned in last week's email, my house got hit by lightning the day before I was scheduled to record with this week's guest, and dealing with the aftermath of that and some other stuff meant there was no backup in place. I planned on dropping a week this summer at some point anyway, so that works out all right. And there wasn't too much damage from the lightning, just some fried electronics, a very scared dog, a plumbing fix that needed doing. But if I needed a sign that I should skip the podcast for a week, that was as good as any. Now, our guest this week is Milton Glaser. Milton, who recently celebrated his 90th birthday, which inspired me to reach out and get him onto the show, is a legendary figure in the world of design. His work has transformed our world in both grand and mundane ways. The thing is, like anyone who has created a really strong, iconic work, there are moments you can kind of resent when that takes attention from all the other work you do over the years. In Milton's case, that iconic work is the I Heart New York design. So, yeah, just that work has achieved worldwide recognition and is part of our cultural currency since the 70s when he made it. It's become an iconography worldwide. But Milton's accomplished so much more over his 90 years. Legendary posters and prints, including the Bob Dylan with psychedelic hair one from 1969, which we'll get into a little bit in the conversation. Restaurant and supermarket design and co-launching New York Magazine and co-founding Pushpin Studios with Seymour Quast, Ed Sorel, and Reynold Ruffins, and a lot more. His designs are, well, again, they're our common language now, and in ways that we don't even understand. Somebody had to make them first. So almost any of his accomplishments taken individually would cement a designer's legacy, but Milton's done all of that and much more, including teaching for 60 years, primarily at School of Visual Arts, from which he retired last year. But that actually seems to be the only thing he has stopped doing in recent years. At 90, he is still working every day. I joined him last week at his studio on East 32nd Street, which he'll soon be giving up for a more accessible place near his home in Chelsea. And he and another designer were working so focusedly on a project, I didn't want to interrupt them by telling them that I'd gotten my mic set up and was ready to record. So I just watched while Milton directed and Ignacio implemented. And then as they interacted and played with ideas and photo sizes and type placements and other elements and things that are completely natural to them and that would make this project look perfect, but to the rest of us would take a million years, and we'd end up making it look like we were doing it in Comic Sans. Eventually, Milton turned around, noticed that I was sitting at our table ready to go, and away we went. Now, as longtime listeners know, I don't exactly get intimidated by guests. Certainly, there's a Mount Rushmore level of certain guests like Clive James, Harold Bloom, and people like that I was a little tentative when I sat down with them. All of that said, I will admit I had a strong desire not to waste Milton's time. Not that I was intimidated by him, because I think we really hit it off quickly and have a fun conversation. But I just got the sense that this guy's time is worth so much. Not that he's 90, but that every moment for him is a moment to work. And that's why over the transom to the building, actually, it's painted "Art is Work," which is the title of one of Milton's many books. There's no way to encompass the influence he's had on our world. You may get a sampling of it by catching the 2008 documentary about him, Milton Glaser, To Inform and Delight. That'll help you learn more about his work, his history, and the level of respect he gets, and not just from designers. Anyway, as far as caveats go for this one, there was some background noise in the studio. I think there was a window open, East 32nd Street, Manhattan. There's some audio artifacts from filtering out the noise from outside around the 10 to 20 minute mark. There's a little weird echoing. Also, I thought, like I said, Milton only had an hour or so and that he wanted to get back to work, so I cut things off a little quickly at the end. Well, we wound up spending another half hour talking about stuff and looking at pages of his next book, which he talks about in the show. He also had a great idea for how I could organize a book around my podcast, which was ingenious and which I never would have come up with. And he got that just out of an hour of conversation with me, because he's Milton Glaser and I'm not. Here's Milton's bio. There are 3 versions of his bio on his website, miltonglaser.com. This brief one, a medium version, and one labeled Interminable Length. Milton Glaser, born 1929, is among the most celebrated graphic designers in the United States. He has had the distinction of one-man shows at the Museum of Modern Art and the Georges Pompidou Center. He was selected for the Lifetime Achievement Award of the Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum in 2004 and the Fulbright Association in 2011. And in 2009, he was the first graphic designer to receive the National Medal of the Arts Award. As a Fulbright scholar, Glaser studied with the painter Giorgio Morandi in Bologna and is an articulate spokesman for the ethical practice of design. He opened Milton Glaser Incorporated in 1974 and continues to produce a prolific amount of work in many fields of design to this day. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Milton Glaser. Tell me about leaving this studio after 54, 55?
65.
55 years. It's been. What's the process been like in terms of deciding what goes to a new studio, what you see as you start paring things down?
It's like when old folks decide to move and scale down their lives, move to a little apartment after being in a big house in Westchester. It's the accumulation is astonishing amount of stuff. I have the entire cellar filled with 250,000 posters, and not to mention everything else that's around, originals, drawings, furniture, whatever. So most of it is just a case of getting rid of stuff, getting rid of documents that date back 50 years, bills from paper suppliers, everything else. So the most difficult thing is getting rid of it, actually, not even choosing what to get rid of, but finding a method for getting out of the building and into the hands of either paper shredders or junkmen.
I did see paper shredders down the block as I was walking here, so they're working on another office right now. They can always come by. But
it's a lot of work for paper shredding, especially since the landfill fills are full. So most of it is just where to put the stuff. And our new studio is slightly smaller, which makes it impossible to take everything. And not that you won't take everything in any case. The difficulty is just, for us, just the amount of stuff.
Mm-hmm. Are there things, though, as you look back, is it that paring away process that, oh, I really want to take this with us, but there's, I just can't.
Sure. Yeah, there's some. Except it has the same feeling of getting rid of those parts of your life that you're finished with And also that the burden of accumulation finally gets to be too much. And people feel relieved when they're not carrying around 700 pictures that they don't need.
Any sense of retrospection? You've been the subject of monographs, et cetera, so you obviously look back on your work in the past, but is this an occasion for that sort of...
Well, it's funny. To some extent, I have forgotten most of the stuff. Yeah. My memory is flawed at best, but I look at stuff that I did and I wonder how I was able to do it. Also, the skill that I once had astonishes me because I can't do that stuff anymore, nor do I have the patience nor the hand skills to do it. So it's a mixed bag. I'm glad to get rid of it. I mean, I feel extremely exhilarated by throwing out the stuff. But you feel that way when you get rid of these encumbrances to your life that you don't look at it anymore.
What sort of things did you get better at over those years?
Thinking.
Yeah?
Yeah, predominantly thinking. And
in terms of solving a
yeah,
problem, or just...
My mind, fortunately, has not degenerated to the same degree that newsprint paper does. And I'm working more actively and faster than I've ever worked before, which I consider to be a blessing. There's a lot of stuff that's bad and that I'm embarrassed about having done, but that's the inevitable consequence of working.
I used to put out a trade magazine for 20 years, so I know the feeling of, you know what, it's over, just get it out, we'll go on to the next one. But of course, you have much longer than 20 years of work with this stuff.
Say the least.
One of my past guests actually profiled you recently, John Leland at the New York Times. When I hit him up to ask how you were before pursuing this, he said, see if you can ask him about the difference between art and design. I meant to get that into the Times, but there wasn't space. Can you talk a little about the...
Yeah.
You can talk a lot about that, I'm sure.
I have a pat answer to that. Basically, a pat answer, because you have to say it at least 3 times a year, and particularly when you're teaching.
We'll talk about teaching also.
Is involved in having an objective and developing a methodology for achieving it. It's mostly left brain, left lobe stuff. You know where you want to go, and you arrive at a way of getting there through a series of steps, largely subject to analysis. Art has nothing to do with that. You don't know where you're going when you do art, and its principal role is changing perception. What you do in art is you change the way people understand what is real. So those two things have nothing to do with one another, particularly because design usually is based on profitability. In most of the design we do, certainly things like identity and corporate identity and trademarks and all that stuff, is about marketing and about achieving more sales. It's about persuasion. Art is not about persuasion, it's about transformation. So you can actually see that there's no real relationship between those two, except for the fact that every once in a while a work of design enters into the realm of art, which is to say, it not only achieves an objective purpose, but it also achieves this strange moment when you change your view of what the world is like.
And the meaning of having art as work over the transom outside this building?
Well, that was my attempt to detoxify the use of the word art. And not to make it something that people use as a means of achieving superiority. The interesting thing about art, of course, is that it's all self-anointed. And nobody who performs art has any idea whether it is or not, because that's a judgment of history. So anyone without any credentials of any kind can call themselves an artist. And there's no disagreement about that, because you can't say why they're not an artist, nor is it of any interest. But the weird thing is that people with no skill, with no understanding, with no capacity for beauty, call themselves artists, and all you can do is shrug your shoulders.
Yeah. Do you remember when you first saw your work in public? A piece of design of yours? Do you remember that instance? It may be a poster or something that was, holy crap, I made that.
Well,
not the art you were making for fellow students.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. When I got out of Cooper, a teacher of mine, George Salter, a splendid man, gave me Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine as a client because he didn't want to do them anymore. And I did a cover for Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine, quite dreadful. And then I told him I couldn't do them. I couldn't do them within the genre that he was doing them. And but it wasn't for me. And it was printed, I may have seen that for the first time, as a printed work. Mm-hmm. I was disappointed in it.
Yeah. Are there instances where it actually works when you see something of your, or are you always picking apart your things when you see them in their final version?
Some are better than others. I mean, yeah. I've had my share of duds. I also had my share of successes. So it's nice, but I don't look at that from a point of view. I like the idea that my work is public. I mean, part of a designer's mission is to produce public works and also works that affect the public in some way. That's the most important thing about being a designer is your social impact. Although that is really not considered to be significant in the art schools anymore, or certainly in the industry. What I have observed is that that largely because it's dominated by marketing and advertising. But in those realms, in the realm of marketing and advertising, the question is never what is the effect on the people who receive this message, and is it harmful to them, as opposed to how many items did you sell. So the objective of design almost invariably is linked to economic reasons, mostly how many did you sell. And that's a business objective, but it's nothing to do with being an artistic objective.
I will note that my first exposure to your work was unwitting. The local supermarket in our town was a Grand Union growing up, so that was always the the standard. Now I realize, this was all a design that comes together. But when we talk about moving from this area to Chelsea for the new place, first, what will you miss about this area, not including having to walk up the stairs at this point? But also, what's your New York as we move into another part of the city? What do you miss here, and then what's New York really?
Well, New York is a series of small towns, and it also is so different from area to area. I never go above 34th Street anymore. I just never find when I do for some doctor's appointment or something, I am astonished how strange the city seems to me. Yeah. And during one's life here, you live in a lot of different places. The first time we actually I was born in the Bronx and grew up in the Bronx and lived in a left-wing neighborhood. And then when I got married, moved to the Lower East Side, St. Mark's Place, and then moved uptown to the West Side to a big apartment on 67th Street, and then moved down to Chelsea, where we now live, and at another time went to Italy for some years, and you only can see a fragment of the city at any one time. You identify with that, and other parts of it are extremely strange, just like visiting a separate universe. New York is truly incomprehensible. It just
in a good way.
So, it's so mutable. It changes. Yeah. Everything changes when you move from east to west, or up to down, and so on. So it's a peculiar place to get a coherent vision of, except we have a kind of vision of it, which is not necessarily self-induced. It comes from all the material and photographs and movies and TV as much as it does from living here.
Although I encountered someone who epitomized the Saul Steinberg New Yorker's vision of the world when she told me she thought Jersey City was South Jersey because it's south of Hoboken, therefore it's just the southern half of the state. I was like, no, really, you're exactly that vision of a New Yorker looking out on everything else. Right. With the Bronx, I've had a few guests who are in their 70s and 80s, and Jerome Charon and Frederick Tutton recently, who talked about how almost all of their lives has been an attempt at escaping the Bronx in different ways. They both live in Manhattan and right. But mentally, the Bronx affected them in certain ways. On the other hand, with Barbara Nessim, when I recorded with her, it's just another memory of her youth. What's the Bronx mean to you, or what did it mean to you vis-a-vis Manhattan?
Well, I grew up in a very interesting, complex area. It was full of communists and people, Jews from Russia and Eastern Europe who feared the onslaught of Hitler, left some years, because it was already in the air, left some years before he emerged, and came to create a perfect workers' universe, a utopia in the Bronx. There were, I imagine, 500 families. Bought a community of apartment houses. They had a complex. And they actually bought the apartments, which was very unusual at that time. It had interracial, for the first time in the United States, had some interracial people living there, a couple of black and white couples. It was extremely progressive, extremely intellectually bound, mad for a perfect community. Everybody went to college. I would say 90% of the kids went on to college, of course, at a time when college was totally free. Yeah. And they got a good education in the public school system, which was great at that time, with really devoted teaching and energy. It was under surveillance by the FBI constantly, who came and sat in the neighborhood in their suits and looked totally out of place. But and then came the McCarthy era, and where a lot of people were repressed and felt under siege once again, and fought back. A lot of political demonstrations in that area, and a commitment to progressive politics. It was extremely optimistic in that regard. I mean, it was full of the idea that things could change. It was a great place to grow up. Stimulating, oriented towards education, and also isolated in the sense that there was a essentially Jewish community, an Italian community, an Irish community. They were all separate and didn't like one another. And I say a group of Irish kids used to come once or twice a year and beat up all the Jews on the street, and then go back to where they lived and so on. So it was funny. There were a real sense of tribal, even then, tribal communities, right? And that perhaps will never leave us.
At what point did you feel at what point did you recognize the political air in which you grew up?
Very, very early.
Had you,
when you were 10 or 11, you were already witness to that. They used to have Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie come and entertain in the auditorium of this apartment complex. Then the apartment, I'm opening my book with a scene. The apartment's rent went up $1 or $2 a month, and nobody could afford it. And so they began to evict people from the apartments and threw them out on the street, literally. And I have a picture of my aunt carrying me out of the apartment with our furniture on the street. And when the picket line saw the cops throwing out this little creature, baby Milton, in the street, they went crazy and they jumped on the horses and and the police began clubbing them. I have that picture in my book.
It's the power of images.
We began to know that there was evil in the world. Mm-hmm. In any case, that was a tumultuous and wonderful beginning.
Mm-hmm. And again, it sounds like your Bronx is more something you're more reconciled to, I guess, as opposed to something you're trying to escape and leave behind, as opposed to some of those authors I mentioned. But tell me about this book.
Oh, I'm doing my final book.
Yeah. Never say final, but go on.
I've done a bunch of books.
It's like the Rolling Stones always had their farewell tour, and they kept coming back.
Kept coming back. Well, this may be my farewell tour. I'm doing a book that is dependent on the idea that everything's connected, that the brain knows everything. It knows everything from the dawn of history. It's all in there. The title of the book comes off a poster I did for the school, which is "To Dream is Human." And I'm saying that dreaming and art making are essentially the same activity. You don't know where you're going. Mm-hmm. The dream or making the art provides a path, and that you find your path by beginning. It's quite the opposite of design, where you know where you're going, or you think you do, and you proceed. But in art making and dreaming, the art takes over or the dream takes over. You have no understanding of where the dream is going or where the art is going. Mm-hmm. It's an experience that we all recognize because we feel enlightened and expanded by that experience. And we don't understand it, and we never shall understand it. But the idea of access to parts of the brain that you didn't know existed and memories that you didn't know you had. So I'm showing also the relationship between all forms, between the ability to crosshatch as drawings and how that idea of the diagonals come about in a design later. That what I try to do is show that there are no independent events. And so the book is transparent. It can start at any point. It doesn't have a chronological or
linear
enter anywhere. And it also is a portal to other things that are online. And that I have an introduction to Morandi, where I write about meeting him. And then I have a talk on Morandi that's available online. And so I refer everybody from the book to electronics. It suddenly occurred to me there's absolutely no reason not to expand the knowledge base by the medium that is our lives now,
that permeates all of us.
Everything else. So, and also because you can't make any books anymore. They all go with a rubbish heap. So you want to make books that basically live forever the way a painting lives forever, and that doesn't get put on a shelf the first time you read it and never looked at again. Mm. That no longer is possible in terms of staying alive. So the book changes depending where you enter and what you read, and there are several points of view simultaneously.
Can you talk a little about the digital world? I know from what I've read, you don't touch the computer.
I never do.
Good. First, how did the advent of computers affect what you do and how design works? Actually, let's go with that. How did digital tools change?
Well, the thing about that, you never know how they affect it. For instance, a pencil is a technology, and the use of a pencil changes people's perception of what form is. And that's certainly true of the computer. The computer is an irresistible technology. And I say this often, it forces you to do what it likes. So when you start using the computer, it's an unwilling slave. What it tries to do is move you towards what it's good at. And so it's good at replication and overlapping, and all those things become what you start doing without knowing it, because the computer has made it easy for you to use its vocabulary rather than your vocabulary.
I remember late 90s working on trade magazines, and we were allowed to do our own design as editors, and all of a sudden everything had drop shadows because somebody figured out how to do drop shadows in Illustrator, and
It spreads like wildfire.
Right.
Also because it's attached to the idea of style and the moment. So it's hard to do work that doesn't look that way anymore. It becomes aberrational when you do something that doesn't look as though it's made by the computer. That's why the field of illustration has been transformed, and the illustration no longer has heroic figures who do personal work. It has a kind of generic look to it. If you look at the Times, 80% of the illustrative material looks as though it came from the same source. And that's because the computer itself has determined what the best and easiest way.
I noticed that at the Society of Illustrators a couple of months ago, they had the winners of their annual award, and there's only a few by other guys I've recorded with, like Barry Blitt and people like that, that had that human touch to them. All of whom send their regards, by the way. Cuneo, Chardello, Blitt, everybody's like, oh my God, you're getting together with Milton. This is great. Speaking of which, do you, the artist and director and music maker Dave McKean in the UK, doesn't know if you know him, but just said you were one of the greatest influences on his career. Pretty storied career over the last 30 or 40 years. But I did tell him I would let you know that was... Speaking of, teaching and your influence on illustrators and designers down the line, when did you first start teaching and feel you were qualified to teach? And did those overlap?
Well, it's over 60 years.
Yeah.
That's a long history of teaching.
Yeah.
I was hired by Silas Rhodes, the founder of the School of Visual Arts, to teach a class. I had no idea.
Did you feel qualified at the time?
No.
Okay.
But I knew I had to begin, and I wanted to teach. And it was a slow entry. But after a couple of years, I developed a methodology. I love to teach. I love that sense that you can impact people's lives for the better. Mm-hmm. And you also want to share what you have learned. I mean, when you ask, well, what was my purpose? Well, the thing that I think of most is that I transmitted what I knew to others, that finally there was a use for what I had accumulated, what I knew how to do, and so on. That went beyond me. And you have to, at one point, identify the fact it's not all about you. I mean, that there are others, and that this sense of communal values and sharing is so intrinsic to the human condition and so overlooked. I mean, we're living in an age, capitalism produces the sense that the only thing that matters is wealth and fame, and that's a terrible basis for culture. So you have to see how you get beyond what the culture itself has recommended to you as a reason to be alive. And I would say that among the very most important is the sense that you're part of a larger system and that you share in the values of that system. And it's not all about you.
Mm-hmm. Do you recall, well, what you had to learn in order to teach, or what you had to figure out how to convey to others? What was intuitive to you that you realized, this can't be intuition, this has to be, at least a certain set of rules and practices?
Well, I think everybody starts the same. They start with technical things. They start teaching people how to do things. They teach them specifically on the size typography should be in relationship to the color, etc. And they teach the working method. But as I say about Morandi, ultimately teaching is not about what you say, it's what you are. And people, the most important thing about teaching is to be something that the student wants to share. That someone like Morandi's devotion to his work was a lesson I never forgot. And Morandi never talked about art, talked about almost anything else, but his presence changed you. So teaching is the student understands that. They understand what the teacher is as much as what the teacher says.
What do you miss most about it?
Well, they only stopped doing it last year. I miss the sense that there's something worthwhile in doing it. Mm-hmm. And there's nothing like seeing somebody transformed by something you've said or demonstrated.
Mm-hmm. Have the students changed over the decades? Were there aspects of students in general that, I mean, I know obviously the technology and the sophistication of things they see, but...
Well, the students at SVA, for instance, now, there's been an enormous change in that it has become vocational, essentially, that all the students really want to learn is how to get a job. Mm-hmm. And that model of a passionate artist who's doing this work because they can't help themselves or because they don't care about making a living has basically disappeared, but not entirely, under the weight of survival and fame. So there's been a shift towards, I'd say over the last 20 years, towards marketing and advertising, dominance of marketing and advertising, which is all about persuasion, and that's what the students are most susceptible to. In fact, most design observers or students think that design is about trademarks or corporate identity. They don't understand that it's a small fragment of design activity, and a rather crummy one, too.
Mm-hmm. Are you able to turn off your design eye when you're walking around in New York, or are you sort of instantly kind of critiquing what you see around you?
But as I told you, I don't think of design as a sort of separate entity. I mean, I think everything is, there's no such thing as
That's what I wondered.
Not design. I mean, design is planning. Mm-hmm. Is fundamentally having an objective of any kind. I mean, when you go out to dinner, you're designing your dinner. I mean, you're thinking, well, I'll have a salty appetizer and a sweet. That's an act of design, right? So I don't parochialize design into segments, right? It's everything. I mean, there's no design without intent, and there's no life without intent.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk about drawing, the importance of drawing as it integrates into your work and your development, and the comics that sort of inspired you when you were learning to draw?
Well, it started with comics. My idea about drawing is it's the only time you're observing what's in front of you. Mm-hmm. My favorite anecdote is the fact that I sat down with my mother when I was, 15 or 16 years old. And I looked at her and I realized I had no idea what she looked like. Yeah. The face that was most important to me in my life, right? And I realized that the only way I would recognize her was by drawing her, because then I had to be observant. And I had to see the peculiarities of the shape of her ear and the tonality of the color of her nose, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So for the first time, I actually observed what is. It's in the Buddhist sense. To observe what is very difficult. And that has to do with whether there is such a thing as reality, and whether drawing itself is a way of engaging what is real. And I do believe it is. And the hand is a kind of brain that continues the neurological path, so that when you draw, that goes from this brain to that brain, and it makes you conscious. Mm-hmm. Most of the time, we're unconscious.
And the way that filtered into who you became professionally as drawing, as you practice, it just is fully integrated in not just...
For me, form making is
It's not just profession.
You have to be doing, and professionally speaking, if you can't draw, and incidentally, most designers cannot draw at all. What they have is a kind of rudimentary anti-drawing method, which is a kind of rebellion against the act of drawing and tradition and
more
history.
of a schematic, or just a bare bones.
It's another generation, so you have to have something to overthrow. And one of the things they overthrow is the ability to draw. Also, it's hard in the sense that you have to commit to doing it consistently. It's like learning how to play the piano. So at first you have to go through these years of doing it before you can do it. And that takes time. I mean, I started life class when I was 12 years old. Mm-hmm. But the most important thing about it is that it gives you the ability to create form. And if you can't draw, you have to find it, which is a different activity. It limits you to what it has already been done. And we can say that is not the best situation to be in.
Sure.
Right. But we are living in an age of collage, which means finding the stuff and assembling it rather than making it. And that's different.
Can you characterize that? You talk a little about and how you function within that world.
Well, I can make anything I can visualize. I can actually translate into an understandable visual language because I can draw. And I can draw well. I mean, and that you don't know what is beauty in drawing and what is observation in drawing. They sort of merged in some peculiar way. But it gives me much greater latitude in terms of what I want to do. I don't want to do trademarks and logos all my life because I think there's such a small and limited activity for somebody who is trained to fundamentally do larger things, more important things, more complex things, and so on. And everything impacts upon everything else. You can't change one thing without changing everything. So I feel that my ability to make things is essential to what I've done. And why, to some degree, that is less frequently encountered now. Because mostly design is about, first it's about a previous understanding of modernism, reductiveness. I started using the phrase in my book of gratuitous ornamentation. Mm-hmm. At one point, the idea of ornament became antithetical to the modern movement. The idea is you got to get rid of all that
strip it all down,
perverse stuff, and strip it all down and make it simple. Simple is nothing simple. So I love the idea that things can be ornamental. After all, this is the appetite of history, right? There's no historical moment when people didn't love ornament, and so the fact that it's persisted for such a long period of time indicates something to us about whether you need it or not. And I am so suspicious of belief because I believe that closely held belief is closing of the mind. If you believe something, you basically have already prejudged.
You've consigned everything else.
Right. So you can't look at anything without preconception. And that makes you incapable of understanding what you're looking at. That, incidentally, goes back to the idea of what art does, because art basically makes you challenge your belief, and that opens your eyes.
Do you still find yourself affected by works of art?
Works of art?
Yeah.
Oh, enormously.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's...
You could still just, particularly with, say, a painter, you can stand in front of a canvas, or is it something... what do you prefer?
A month ago, the three of us went uptown. It started the day by going uptown to look at Piero della Francesca, which is hanging at the Morgan. at the Frick. And we went up for a half hour just to look at the 3 Pierrots that they had. It was a great way to start the day. And what else is there? I mean, also they are truly miraculous works. There are miraculous works in history that inform everything we do. But of course, what happened with the modern movement is it swept away all those traditional references. I use everything as a reference.
You mentioned how every generation is overthrowing influences. Right. Was modernism what you needed to?
Well, we started Pushman Studios with an attack on modernism, which, first of all, it was narrative, and you're supposed to be abstract. And we thought storytelling was an important part of design, and it was eclectic. It used, I used references from Persian painting, from Oriental watercolors, from the Wiener Werkstatt, all that stuff. It seemed to me was what you want to have access to in your work. And so we do.
Mm-hmm. One of my past guests, and I won't say who to embarrass him or anything, mentioned his longtime interest in the fact that Pushpin overlapped with the Beatles, and wonders between you and Seymour who was Lennon and who was McCartney. And I don't know if you've ever contemplated that level of it. And was Ed Sorrell George Harrison? That was the triumvirate.
Yeah, Eddie was at the studio a very short time.
Yeah, so he sort of gives him the George thing.
We came out of Cooper, and we got together and started to work together. And the nice thing about it, it was a community. We all worked in a big room, and we all shared. We worked in groups. We all shared what we were doing. Everybody could see what everybody else was doing and participate in that. And that doesn't happen very often historically. Artists tend not to want to work together.
Right.
They do it occasionally and so on, like the Wiener Werkstatt and the arts and crafts movement and so on. And we were around for 20 years. We did it for 20 years, and it had ultimately a significant impact on the culture and on the history of design.
No one ever knows in the moment, but did you feel that this was a collection of talent that was sort of pantheon level?
No, we did want to continue the experience of going to Cooper Union where we were friends, and we liked that idea. We liked each other. We had no idea as
the impact you were going to have.
Yeah. I mean, in the sense that we had no idea of the implications or the effect of the work. We knew that we had a point of view that was not exactly the same as everyone else's, but
to know that it would resonate and grow like that is not something
we didn't
you
know
feel.
that.
Yeah. Was it in teaching that you started to see somewhat of your own legacy? I mean, dropping aside any self-congratulatory bullshit, blah, 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 you're hugely influential within this world. Was there a trigger for that, or a sense that you started to recognize?
There were a lot of young designers who were coming up and were doing work that was the truth of the matter is that we never engaged the larger community of design because we were eccentric. And so we don't sort of fit into official design history exactly. What's that guy? Sujek, that guy's the head of the Victoria and Albert.
Barbara mentioned his name when we recorded, and I can't remember right now.
He wrote a whole book about the history of design without mentioning anything we'd done. And I realized in the official histories, I mean, you have, everybody from Frank Lloyd Wright to Gropius and so on. There is an official history, and Pushman never fit into that history. It was, as I said, aberrational. And so it enormously influential without being observed by the design community as a force. And retrospectively, that simply isn't true. That whole rather dreadful psychedelic era, that way of drawing, which I now dread, but it had an enormous influence on design at that moment. Fortunately, it is largely past, but
your name is still on that Dylan poster.
Still, right. Still on, and it continues to sell more than any other thing I've ever done, except for I Heart New York.
Yeah, so. I was going to take a picture a day or two before we were supposed to get together last week, and I don't know if they told you why we didn't get together last week. My house was hit by lightning. Yeah,
you were hit by lightning?
The house was.
The house was.
And the great moment was the next morning when the electrician came over and was fixing things and said, well, you could do this, this, and this in future, but you do have to ask yourself, what are the chances this is going to happen twice? So, yeah, there was that. But the night before that happened, I was in an airport waiting for my brother's flight to come in, and a whole squad of tourist kids go walking by with the I Heart New York T-shirts on, and I thought, Milton would either really like to see this or be very mad at seeing this, and I just don't want to find out by showing him a picture on my phone. Just that sense that it's everywhere, and
well, that's weird. I mean, also at a certain point, it no longer belongs to you. I mean, it's first I don't understand it because it has become so universal. It happens sometimes, right? And you don't exactly know why. You've done maybe 100 logos, and this one suddenly explodes all over the world. I mean, in every country, in China, Japan, there's always a variation of it. And so at a certain point, it stops belonging to you. I mean, it just...
old girlfriend of mine on the first anniversary of 9/11 had it tattooed on the back of her neck, and funny. That was the... Okay, this
that's
is,
funny. I hope she had it removed.
Well, the hair's long enough, it covers things, but, she just wanted it to symbolize her love for the city. Well, I know you have a home outside of New York. Do you get up to Woodstock much?
I do. I've sort of had an incident some years ago where I thought it was a stroke and I wasn't able to walk. It's about a year ago. And so we stopped going to Woodstock for 9 months, but we've resumed that again.
Okay. Because one of my other past guests lives up there, and I haven't seen him around. And
we haven't been around.
Yeah.
Also, we've never seen him around because we never go out of the house. I mean,
that's one of those. When I went up there to record with him, I realized I live out in the woods in northern New Jersey, but the houses are a little bit closer together.
Right.
Up there, I thought that's privacy. That's good.
It is.
Is there a sense of getting away from the city that's necessary for you?
I think it is. I mean, first of all, there are happy spaces and sad spaces, and our house is a wonderful house. You go and you're happy. It's also surrounded by green, which I think changes the mind. And just sitting in that atmosphere, you cool out a little bit. I love being in the city. I mean, I have the city is a real chore these days. I mean, getting crosstown takes 45 minutes. It costs $35. I mean, things have become physically impossible. But
Trust
the excitement, the access.
Even my drive-in today, I gave myself 2 hours to get from 25 miles from the George Washington to here. And
Madness.
I thought, well, I'm going to make it, but we'll see how close.
No, it's madness.
Yeah.
But there's nothing like it.
Right.
I mean, mostly because of the people you know.
Mm-hmm. And do you engage much in the culture in terms of
No, I don't engage in anything. I mean,
it's really just people and conversation?
a very insular life. I've been possessed by my work for a long time. I love to work. Now doing this thing with Ignacio is so much pleasure for me. I'm very old, but I have a lot of energy for the work. Mm-hmm. That's great.
You talk about collaboration.
Yeah.
The fact that, like you mentioned with Pushpin, how it was artists, all of you working together, and this entire world is you working with your studio, with others. Yeah. How does that differ from, I guess, you sketching on your own, making art solo?
Well, you collaborate a lot with clients. I've had wonderful partners. I had the collaboration with Jerome Snyder writing The Underground Gourmet. I had a collaboration with Sir James Goldsmith, a terrible reactionary who I had a very good relationship with, to do he owned L'Express and then all these supermarkets that I did, the Grand Union, which was an enormous job, which I had about 30 people working. But then I realized I had suddenly become a manager, and I hated that.
George Lois mentioned something along those lines also when you get further and further removed from the work itself and more about personnel. Yeah.
And so now I have Ignacio, one or two other people, because I don't want to do work I don't want to do. Mm-hmm. And if you have a staff, you have to take work you don't want to do. And that becomes a professional task, but it prevents you from doing the deepest, most meaningful things for yourself. So I try not to do that.
Are there signals when clients are interested that you're just like, no, this is not?
Immediately I can tell by a phone call whether I can work with somebody.
Yeah. And
I don't. And the other day somebody called saying, what would it cost to do a logo for a luxury condominium? That's the end of the conversation.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't have to go a step further. You know. We all know everything.
Right.
So you can tell immediately whether someone is going to be harmful to you or nourishing.
Yeah.
If you accept the fact that you know.
Right. And you're in a, like you said, in a environment now where it's not, you don't have to take on the bad client. Right. Can you make the logo bigger guy? That's
all that kind of stuff.
Now, well, I was rewatching To Inform and Delight, the documentary about you, which I'd seen years ago. They mentioned the project you did on Dante's Purgatory. Much of a reader, or are you? It was essentially that book in particular,
no,
or that comedy in
particular. I never read fiction.
Yeah.
I never read novels. I read for information. Mm-hmm. I like to read about behavior and aesthetics, but I don't understand why people like to read novels. I don't get it. I know you're supposed to understand the human condition better, but I don't do that.
Yeah.
So.
Because you understand the forms in the world around you? Or you spend your life interpreting those forms?
I have no idea. It's just a matter of taste. But Shirley, my wife, reads all the time. She reads every English novel that's ever been written. But that's her life.
Long marriage. Good suggestions for
60 years.
Yeah. Or does she have better suggestions for marriage longevity? Or is there...
Well, the suggestions are always the same. Except what is. I mean, it's very hard to do. Mm-hmm. It's very hard to be in a marriage without trying to fix the other. That doesn't work. Either her on me or me on her. And you never get finished with it. I mean, it doesn't. One day that you don't come to an understanding where you both sort of
we're complete.
Right? It doesn't happen. I mean, you have to learn how to argue and let it go. Mm-hmm. I mean, you're two different people. You have two different values. You like two different things. You can't reconcile them.
Yeah.
And accepting the fact that there are things that you will never reconcile, that the other will never be exactly what you want, is the first step. And then just a general sense of goodwill towards the other. You have to basically feel admiring of no matter what the other is doing, unless you really want to break up.
Yeah.
It takes work.
Sounds like you've worked that out over 60. It could be like the sign over the transom, marriage is work also.
Right.
But religion, Judaism versus Jewishness? Because we're both Jewy.
I feel very Jewish.
Yeah.
But I feel very non-religious at the same time. I mean,
was there any sense of it when you were growing up, or was it communist enough that religion wasn't...
The left wing, largely anti-religious, except for the Hasidim, who were nuts. And so when you see that, it's not, although I think the essential values of education and being a good citizen are deeply Jewish, and that part of it I subscribe to. But I have no orthodox idea. I mean, I think all religions are basically devices to control others. And when I see religious people acting self-satisfied and authoritative, I say, you stupid fuck. But I understand its purpose. I mean, I understand what religion is about. But fundamentally, I think it's conspiratorial and of no personal use outside of the fact there is something spiritual in the world. Don't dispute spirituality. There is something called a soul. Don't dispute that. But the orthodox forms are silly, I mean, fundamentally silly. Although probably when I'm buried,
you'll find otherwise, or you won't mind at that point.
I won't mind.
I refer to Zen Judaism as my semi-sort of practice. Regrets about working on Trump vodka? Is that a...
Yes. Right now I'm wondering whether I should publish an anecdote in my book about Trump. Trump came.
Yeah.
And he didn't pay his bill. He paid half his bill, as usual.
Yeah.
So, and then a journalist came to interview me, and he said, what do you think about working with Trump? Well, I said, it's like most businessmen. The only thing I didn't understand was his hair. I can't figure out where it comes from, because there's nothing structural about it. And what does he feel with people when they look at the top of his head and see this strange thing sitting on it? So Trump wrote me back. He wrote a very funny note. It says, "Not nice, Milton." That's all. And it's big.
Yeah, in that giant handwriting.
And I actually I sent him a note back saying, you're probably right. It's probably not nice to use somebody's physical attributes as a way of undermining them. So now I don't know whether I should... I certainly would not do a job for Trump now. At that point, he was just another jerky businessman. But now I don't know whether I should include that anecdote in my book or not.
I think so.
It's still bad judgment.
I don't think he'll hold it against you any more than he holds all of New York against him. Final question.
The Mueller.
Oh, yeah?
Did you watch any of the Mueller hearing?
No, I had it on my phone while I was driving in and thought I will lose my attention to the road if I pay attention.
It's on this afternoon, too. Yeah. It's quite alarming.
Yeah. Final question, though, comes from Barbara Nessim, who asks, can Milton still do the twist?
I was a good dancer when my feet obeyed me, but that's no longer the case. I probably, under duress, could do it.
She's still doing salsa?
Yeah, well, Barbara is another story.
That she is. Milton, thanks so much for coming on the show.
You're very welcome.
And that was Milton Glaser. You should learn all you can about him and his work. You should start out by checking out his studio's website, where you can learn more about the posters, the prints, essays, interviews, videos, case studies of his work, and so much more. And that's miltonglaser.com, which is MiltonGlaser. You should also go to the New York Times website and check out 2 articles on him by past podcast John Leland. The recent one that John did features that Dylan poster that Milton sort of hates. Also, Milton's published a bunch of books on graphic design, his posters, monographs of his work, drawing, children's books, including 2 with his wife Shirley, and a lot more. Honestly, I mean, I feel like we barely scratched the surface in this conversation, so I'm sort of hoping we'll get a chance for a follow-up, maybe once he's settled in the new studio, and we can talk about what he actually took with him and what stayed behind. Whether or not that happens, I have to say this is one of the best experiences I've ever had doing this podcast. And I'm thankful Milton gave me the hour plus of his time. I want to thank his studio mates immensely for also taking a break and letting us do this without having to impose on Milton. Thank you. This was a very memorable experience. Now, after we wrapped, I did not ask Milton, so, who you been reading? Because, again, I thought he wanted to get back to work. But I do ask a lot of other guests that question, and if you want to hear their answers to that and get some extra conversation, you'll need to become a supporter of the Virtual Memories Show so you can get access to our quarterly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet. I'll get started on the second quarter 2019 episode soon, but the first quarter one features book recommendations and some extra conversation with Jerome Charan, Peter Cooper, Edmund White, Eva Hagberg, Mort Gerberg, James Osland, Joe Chardello, James Sturm, Martin Hagland, Bram Presser, and Nathan Englander. You can support the Virtual Memories Show via patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod. I've got all sorts of goals and goodies in place for patrons, including that podcast, a patron-only blog, handwritten show notes for every episode, my secret project that I'm now thinking I really, really need to get back to, and more. So go to patreon.com/VMSpod and support the art of fine conversation. Now, I recorded this one at Milton's studio on East 32nd Street. That meant a $12 toll at the George Washington, $30 or so for parking, $6 for the subway, a couple of bucks for cold brew coffee and a muffin around the corner from his place. Now, if you want to help defray some of the costs of the Virtual Memories Show, like web hosting, travel, equipment, coffee, or just toss me some money because you think the show is worth it, then visit patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod and make a one-time or recurring donation. A special thanks go out to Nick Bartosik, Buzz Carter, Michael Hacker, Michael Janizik, Fred Kish, Jonathan Kranz, Kevin Katila, Jack Lescamella, Teresa Lewis, Stephen Nadler, Barbara Nessim, Jim Ottaviani, Payne Prophet, Dmitry Samarov, Stephen Solomon, Greg Tanner, Ford Thomas, and Garrett Zecker for going over and above in their support of the Virtual Memories Show. We have the full list of show supporters at chimeraobscura.com/VM. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSpod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.